Clearing out my father's study, I found something that I can't explain. Story by Norse Selection 9. When my father had pressed his 9mm Walters pistol to his temple, I had been 500 miles away, working through a cafe in adult haze to meet the looming deadline for my next column. I'd only received the call 2 days later, after a concerned neighbor had made a house call and found his body sprawled across the kitchen table. There was no note, explanation for his actions. My father lived and died, a mystery to all who knew him, including me. He was a reclusive man, preferring to shut himself away in his study. After debating with myself for a while, I decided to travel over to pay my final respects. Despite our differences, he was still the man who raised me. The funeral was a quiet affair, exactly the way he would have wanted it, attended by about 10 or so people, the few friends and relatives that he had left. I had met with my father's lawyer after he was buried, who had rifled through a stack of papers. I was surprised to find out that my father had left me the house, even though it had been years since we had last spoken. I had no intention of living in it. My first impulse was to put it on the market as soon as possible. Even as an adult, just walking into his office was enough to make my stomach swirl with nausea. A relaxing box containing the corpse of dozens of insects lay on the polished oak of his desk, their exoskeletons impaled through with pins to card points that bore my father's hasty cursive. Some had been grotesquely heightened by the magnifying glass that lay across the board, until they looked about the size of a human thumb, amidst an assortment of forceps, brushes, and glass heads. The papery, polychromatic wings of butterflies were peeled back on a setting board, looking ready to flap away at any minute. As a child, I had suffered vivid nightmares about my father's macabre collection coming to life and crawling all over me. I could barely stand to be in that room for more than 5 minutes. I could never understand why my father had devoted his entire life to studying them. As I tried to maneuver around the clutter, pain exploded up my leg from my foot. I hopped backwards on one leg, my big toe throbbing painfully. Half tucked under my father's desk was a battered leather suitcase. Assuming it was just more of his supplies, as he'd like to call them, I had scanned the expanse of the desk and found a small, oval-headed brass key hidden amongst the mess. After steadying myself, I'd slid it in and unlocked it. Nothing could have prepared me for what met my eyes. Stuffed inside the suitcase was a dark green, tubular object, about 2 feet long. The texture was hard, almost shell-like, but felt polished to the touch. When I placed my hand on it, faint vibrations of life pulsed through. A chrysalis. As I was lifting up the suitcase, my finger caught on the rusting latch, tearing through the skin, sprinkling red onto the green. Even though I was far from an expert as my father had been, I knew that one of this size wasn't normal. I had no idea that something like this could exist, but here one sat on the floor of an unremarkable house in rural Colorado. Rifling deeper inside for any answers, a dust-covered, leather-bound journal tumbled onto the carpet. As I picked it up and rifled through the yellowed pages, I recognized the curving letters scribbled inside. My father's handwriting. After leaving the object where I'd found it, I had gone to the living room where I found myself able to breathe. Seating myself down on the sofa, I'd leafed through to the very first entry. May 13th,
1994. The tribe lives deep within the rainforest. Our guide reckons we'll have to hike a day or two to reach them. I still can't believe that we're actually here, that the university granted us the funding for this trip. As costly as it was, what we will return with to the States will be priceless. I have reason to believe that the area is home to an undiscovered species of Lepidoptera of unusual size, or locally known as the ghost moth. No one believes me, but the accounts are too prolific to just be fairy tales. I know it's out there, and these people just might help me find it.
Lepidoptera. I recognized the words from the winding diatribes my father went on in a rare few occasions he had actually spoken to me. He tried to enlighten me about the insect world, but just induced fits of skull-numbing boredom. I read the passage over and over, trying to make sense. It sounded like the scientific discovery of the century. So why had he bundled it up in a suitcase for over 20 years?
May 14th, 1994. We're getting closer now. The jungle holds a wonderful array of exotic specimens. I just wish I had enough desk space for all of them. But they aren't my goal here. The only one I'm coming home with is the ghost moth itself.
I woke up still sitting on the couch, the sun warming the back of my neck. The journal sat on my lap, still at the same page. While trying to rub the sleep from my eyes, I stumbled to the kitchen past the adjacent office, the door still open. After reality hit me, I raced back to the doorway. The suitcase was empty. I rushed into the room, scattering up the papers that littered the ground. There, just a few feet away, lay the chrysalis. I stood here, trying to make sense of the situation. I had left it lying inside the suitcase. There was no possible way that it could have moved. I'd probably just knocked it over without realizing when I'd found the diary.
May 15th, 1994. We arrived at their village just before sundown. Though our guide helped clear the air for us, the people remained cautious, understandably slow. They barely say a word, standing still like statues, and watch us from behind the trees. They see it as a god. They speak of livestock and even humans that were snatched up in the middle of the night by it. They live in silence, for fear that the slightest noise will draw its presence. They have a name for it, which, roughly translated, means the white-winged one that devours. It's the kind of stories that flourishes out here in the wild, conjured up by unseen predators in the dark. It's not about to stop us now.
No, Dad. I shook my head. Whenever my father got fixated on something, he just couldn't let go. There was no one or nothing could pry him away from it. Not me, not his colleagues, or even my mother leaving him. He would toil over it for hours without sleep or food until he was certain, even when he had lost everything else.
May 16th, 1994. I keep hearing something cry out into the night. It's probably a jaguar or something of the like. The natives refuse to go beyond the tree border. I can see now why they were so afraid. Even our lights can't penetrate the darkness. We've gone too far now. I'm not coming back to the States empty-handed.
My fingers wavered over the tattered edge of the page. I didn't know what I was going to find on the other side. I felt as if I had found something that was never meant to be discovered. The next entry was less legible than the previous ones. My father's usually compact script, now spidery ink scrolls that slid over the lined pages. The margins patterned with panicked reddish-brown fingerprints. I had to spend a few minutes roving over it to decipher it, and when I did, my stomach clenched.
May 17th, 1994. It took Henry in the night. We were seated around the fire when we heard the most horrible scream. I'll never forget it, as long as I live. We were all sitting around the campfire when suddenly there was a flap of wings and he vanished from the log he was sitting on. The last we saw was him screaming 20 feet off the ground, still clutched in that horrible thing's claws. I can't explain how it happened. I've heard of the Hercules moth, but this is something far beyond that. Creatures like that aren't supposed to exist in this world. May 18th, 1994. The jungle is endless. Civilization seems to get farther away the longer we travel. It took 2 more of us in the night. Julia was the first to go. she was going to get married in the summer, after we came back. It tore through her like paper. We found parts of Raoul hanging in the trees. The screaming has changed. I can almost hear their voices in its call. I can probably smell the fear seeping out of my pores right now. I wish I'd listened to the stories. There's so much more to fear than the dark. May 19th, 1994. I'm the last one left. I'm hiding from it in the trees, but I reckon I only have a few days at most before it finds me, just like it did to the rest. I can hear it calling me, taunting me in Henry's voice. It's trying to lure me out. This thing isn't any creature of earth. It's the devil. The one thing that is keeping me alive is the hope of finding its nest. It's probably nocturnal, so I have a better chance of destroying it in the day. That is, if I even make it to dawn. May 20th, 1994. It's over. I tracked it through the jungle to its nest with a rag on a stick soaked in kerosene. It was 20 feet worth of sticky white threads that trailed from tree to tree. I heard it before I saw it. However, this time, I was ready. I ignited the stick and used the light to lure it in before I threw it at night. I'll never forget the screams as it writhed about on the jungle floor, as its wings were burnt to ashes. I know that it won't bring Henry or the others back. My hands are just as stained by their blood as the creature's proboscis, but I refuse to let their deaths be in vain. I need to know what this thing is, even if it takes me my entire life. I'm the only survivor, but I'm not alone.
I hurled the book down, my heart quivering in my mouth. I was determined to do what my father never had the courage to do and destroy it. I would burn that chrysalis until there was nothing left but ashes. Whatever was inside it, it didn't belong here. As I was digging through the kitchen cabinet, a sound like a watermelon being split open pierced the air. I raced to the source of the sound, my father's study, flinging the door open. The chrysalis was swelling up before my very eyes, the fragile covering cracking and flaking onto the floor as it struggled to contain the rapidly growing from it within. Images of my own bleeding finger flashed through my mind, overcome with the sick realization. It was already too late. Somehow, I knew that I was responsible for its awakening. A pair of massive insectoid white wings unfurled themselves out of a large fracture with a wingspan about 3 feet across. I stood frozen. The box of matches still gripped in my hand, both horrified and mesmerized. The wings gave an exceptional flap, conjuring up a blast of cool air that nearly bowled me over. There was one final peeling crack as the entity inside it wrenched itself out. Although I only got a brief glimpse of it, I can say that it was no insect. No specimen in my father's workshop ever had a single pair of long, milk-white, almost human arms, crowned with 5 long fingers that pulled themselves out of their cracked cocoon. The last thing I remember is a tall shape lunging at me, so fast that I couldn't make out anything else. I awoke to the acrid taste of my own blood slithering down the bridge of my nose and dripping into my mouth from the throbbing wound on my forehead. As I pulled myself off the ground and back into consciousness, I became aware of a low howl growing louder in my ears, accompanied by a flapping sound. I flinched, my hands groping around the floor for anything that might be considered a viable weapon. A sharp pain raced up my forearm. Looking down, I saw the carpet was sprinkled with fragments of broken glass. An abrasive chill slapped my cheek, and I looked up to see a star-shaped hole in the adjacent window where the wind whistled through. Just above the chrysalis, now a long, empty shell, The burgundy curtains shivered in the air that escaped inside. I stared out into the falling night as the winged creature shrank into the distance, heading in the direction of the lights of the distant town already blinkering into existence. It shrieked, shaking the sky.
Hi everyone, Matt Chatter here. I'd like to thank Tingly Horror for her awesome ASMR narration tonight. We had a great time putting this video together, and there will be more of our collaborations to come in the near future. Be sure to check her out and subscribe for more chilling ASMR storytelling. Well, thanks for tuning in, and you'll be sure to hear from me very, very soon. Bye for now. And remember, when all goes wrong in the night and everything's the matter, you'll be sure to hear of it from the Mad Chatter.